Ever get that feeling like some of the stuff we believe, even like the really big important things, might have gotten kind of like a little twisted? Yeah, we're going to look at that today. It's like that game, telephone. Yeah. But instead of like, just some silly phrase, it's beliefs and stuff passed down through generations. We're going to take a deep dive into how people interpret sacred texts and how that, I guess, can lead to practices and beliefs that are like totally off base. Specifically Christian scriptures for this one.
It's crazy how these interpretations, like even if they start small, can totally snowball into something completely different.
Yeah.
It's happened throughout history and in different cultures and stuff.
For this deep dive, the source material really goes into this. It explores how what it calls egoistic interpretations has shaped the way people see things like alcohol. And it's even led to some pretty wild superstitions. It's basically about people taking teachings and twisting them to fit their own agenda or whatever.
It really makes you wonder, though, right? Like how much of what we believe is actually from the original text versus what's been added or changed over time.
Totally. And let's just start with this whole alcohol thing. It's not something we always, think about, but religion and alcohol have a pretty complex relationship. This source points out some pretty conflicting messages about alcohol in the Bible itself.
Right, like there's the story of Jesus turning water into wine at a wedding.
Mm-hmm.
You can find that in John 2.111. It's a super famous story, often used to say that like enjoying a glass of wine is totally fine.
Okay, but then you also have those passages in the Bible that explicitly warn against getting drunk, Ephesians 5.18. So how do we even try to reconcile these opposite messages?
Well, that's where the whole thing about egoistic interpreters comes in, I guess.
Yeah.
The source says they basically cherry pick parts of the Bible that fit their agenda. They promote alcohol consumption while kind of downplaying the parts that warn about, the dangers. And that's had some pretty big consequences.
Totally. Just think about how this has shaped what's considered normal when it comes to drinking. In some cases, drinking too much is not only accepted, but almost expected. And it's partially thanks to these interpretations. Really makes you think about how these interpretations can be so powerful, once they're widespread.
Oh, for sure. And it's not even just about shaping social norms or whatever. This is totally fueled the alcohol industry, which raises a bunch more ethical questions. Can you use religious stuff to profit from something that can be harmful? That's a conversation for another time, I guess.
Yeah, it really does make you think. But what really stood out to me was how the source connected this whole twisting of teachings thing to a whole bunch of different superstitions. It's like we just talked about how someone might twist something to justify having a glass of wine, but then it goes on to talk about stuff like blaming illnesses on evil spirits.
What's interesting is that both alcohol and these superstitions play on a very basic human thing. It's that need for comfort and control when things are uncertain. When you don't understand why something is happening, it's tempting to look for easy answers.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So someone might turn to alcohol for comfort or escape, and that can be tied back to these interpretations that downplay the risks. And at the same time, if you're living in a time when you don't have science to explain stuff, blaming illness on evil spirits might feel like it gives you some control over the situation.
Exactly. The source even uses witch hunts as an example. Back then, without science to explain things like mental illness or weird behaviors, it was really easy to just call someone a witch and blame them for bad stuff. This gave power to the people in charge because they could control the narrative and eliminate anyone who challenged them.
Wow, so it wasn't just about blaming someone for bad luck, it was a way to keep control.
Think about it. If you can make people believe that they're constantly under threat from evil spirits or witches, then they'll look to you, the interpreter, for protection and guidance.
It's kind of creepy to think about how easy it is to manipulate people when they're afraid and looking for answers. And the source keeps going with this. It connects these misinterpretations to a bunch of other beliefs, too. Like seeing dreams as messages from God, blurring the lines between astronomy and astrology, and even attributing natural disasters to divine punishment.
Each of those examples shows how these egoistic interpreters might exploit a lack of understanding or a need for comfort to further their own agenda.
Okay, so let's unpack some of these examples a little more because some of this stuff sounds eerily familiar even today.
It's easy to think that in our modern world and all, with all the science and stuff, that we'd be immune to this kind of manipulation. But the truth is we're still, programmed to look for explanations, especially for things we just don't understand.
So you're saying even with all the answers that science has given us, we're still vulnerable to these egoistic interpretations. Why is that?
It's because a lot of times these interpretations tap into our deepest fears and desires. You know, think about it. Who wouldn't want to believe they can control what happens to them by, like, reading the stars? Or that some simple ritual can keep bad luck away?
Yeah, you're right. Those beliefs offer a sense of security and control in a world that can often feel pretty chaotic. But the source also talked about how attributing natural disasters to, like, divine punishment was another way these interpretations were used.
Imagine living in a time before we knew about, like, plate tectonics or weather patterns and all that. Like an earthquake or a flood would have been totally terrifying, and you wouldn't even know why it was happening. It makes sense that people would look for meaning, you know, even if that meant, like, blaming themselves or seeing it as a sign of God's anger.
And that just plays right to the hands of someone looking to use those fears to their advantage. If they can make themselves seem like the interpreter of, God's will, they gain a ton of power and influence.
Exactly. And that influence goes way beyond just natural disasters. The source also talks about this fascinating connection between astronomy and astrology.
Oh, yeah. I've always been kind of curious about that. They seem so different to us now. Like, one is science and the other one, well, not so much.
Yeah, it's like the perfect example of how this genuine desire for knowledge, like in this case, wanting to understand the stars.
Right.
Yeah, it's the perfect example of how that can be twisted. Astronomy, which is like, the study of space stuff, got all mixed up with astrology, which claims that the stars, like, control our lives.
So you're saying that those who wanted to, like, stay in power saw this opportunity in people's fascination with the stars. They could make predictions based on astrology and then just claim it was divine knowledge.
It's classic,
Yeah.
using a little bit of truth, like the actual positions of the stars, to create a whole system of control. And it worked. People were just awed by these, like, profound insights and never even realized they were being manipulated.
It reminds me of how the source talked about interpreting dreams as messages from God. People still do that today. But the source suggests that this, too, can be a type of egoistic interpretation.
Think about, like, what that means. If you really believe that your dreams hold the key to your future, you might become way too reliant on interpreting those dreams. And you might not take action in your own life.
It's like giving up your own agency, your own ability to make choices and actually take control. And that plays right into the hands of someone who wants to control you, whether it's a religious leader or anyone else who claims to have some special knowledge.
The source wants us to, be more discerning, to question these interpretations instead of just blindly accepting them.
Yeah.
But that's hard, right? We all want easy answers. We want someone to just tell us what it all means.
Yeah, it's almost like our brains are wired for these kinds of interpretations, We want certainty and meaning, and sometimes we ignore stuff that doesn't fit.
But here's the thing. Holding on to these misinterpretations, even if they make us feel better, it comes at a price.
What do you mean? Like, what's the price we pay?
It's the price of critical thinking, of questioning and challenging what we're told. It's the price of taking responsibility for our own lives and our own beliefs.
But isn't faith supposed to be about trusting in something bigger than yourself? Something you might not always understand?
I think true faith is, like, more complicated than that. It's about, like, wrestling with tough questions and trying to understand different perspectives. And then in the end, like, coming to your own understanding, blind acceptance. That's what egoistic interpreters want.
I see what you mean. So how can we find that balance? How do we approach faith with an open mind without falling prey to these distortions and stuff?
It's definitely a process. And it starts with realizing that religious texts, like anything else that's written down, are open to interpretation. They were written a long time ago in specific cultures and stuff. And it's super important to understand that before jumping to conclusions.
You mean, like, instead of just reading something in the Bible and saying, okay, this is what it means, we got to ask ourselves, who wrote this? When was it written? What was going on in the world at that time? And what were they even trying to say?
Yeah, exactly. And it might take some work to find those answers. It means doing research, reading different interpretations, and even being willing to challenge our own ideas about things.
It's definitely not that passive approach to information that we're so used to, but it sounds like it's worth it. The more we know about the context, the less likely we are to be fooled by misleading interpretations.
And here's the thing. Once you start practicing critical thinking, it becomes like second nature. You start to use it for everything, not just religious teachings.
So it changes other areas of life too, like how we read the news, how we think about politics, even just how we make decisions every day.
Exactly. It's about being more aware, more discerning, and more confident in your ability to tell what's real from what's fake.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects. But the source also talked about the role of science in challenging these misinterpretations. I think some people think that faith and science are like enemies or something.
Yeah, that's a pretty common thought. But I think faith and reason can totally work together, even like help each other out. Think of it this way. Science helps us understand how the world works, and faith often tries to answer why things are the way they are.
I like that. It's not about picking sides. It's about finding a way to bring them together.
Right. Faith can give you a sense of meaning and purpose, a way to see where you fit in the universe.
Yeah.
And science can teach us about the world, helping us make good decisions and, solve problems.
The important thing is to not let one take over completely. Blind faith without reason can lead to dogma and intolerance. And a purely scientific view without any spirituality can feel empty or, meaningless.
What's cool about being human is that we can believe in different things at the same time. We can be amazed by science and also find comfort and inspiration in our faith.
It sounds like the goal is to always be learning, to be open to new information, willing to change our minds when we see evidence, and okay with the fact that there are some things we'll just never fully understand.
That's a great way to put it. It's about embracing the journey of discovery, both in our faith and in figuring out the world around us.
And sometimes that journey might make us question things we were always sure about, but that's all right. It's through those questions that we grow. It's through those questions that we understand things better and become more resilient to manipulation and fake news and stuff.
So going back to the idea of false prophets or egoistic interpreters, the best way to deal with them isn't to ignore them, but to really think about their ideas. Ask questions, look for evidence, compare their interpretations to other stuff you read, and then decide for yourself what you believe.
And remember, even people in charge, even people who say they have all the answers, they're still just people. They make mistakes, they have biases, and they might even have their own agendas.
It's all about taking control. Become someone who really thinks about the information they see. Think for yourself and trust your gut. You can choose what you believe and find your own truth.
That's a really powerful message, and it goes way beyond religion. It's about everything in our lives.
Totally. It's about being someone who actively participates in their own life rather than passively just accepting whatever information is thrown at them.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this one question. If misinterpretations can mess with our lives so much, how can we become people who really think about the information we get, whether it's religious, scientific, or whatever?
That's a great question. And I hope it's a question our listeners will keep thinking about long after this episode is over.
Thanks for coming with us on this journey of discovery. It's been an amazing exploration.
The pleasure was all mine. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep searching for your own truth.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking about how those egoistic interpretations can twist religious teachings and lead to practices and beliefs that are way off, from the original message.
Yeah, and we've talked about how it's super important to look at all information, especially religious teachings, with a critical eye.
Totally. But it's one thing to talk about critical thinking, but it's another to actually do it, Yeah. So for this last part of our deep dive, let's get practical. How can we get better at critical thinking and become more discerning in a world that's full of information?
I think it starts with questioning everything. I don't mean being all cynical or dismissive.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about having healthy skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
Don't just accept stuff, especially when it's big claims or pronouncements from authority figures.
So next time someone tells me something profound, whether it's about religion, politics, or even just everyday stuff, my first thought should be wait a minute, what's the proof?
Exactly. And don't be afraid to dig deeper. Ask for sources, look for different opinions, and see if the information matches up with what you already know.
The source also talked about how important it is to look for multiple perspectives. It's so easy to get trapped in our own little bubbles, surrounded by people who agree with us all the time. But that can stop us from seeing other possibilities.
It's like trying to understand a complicated problem by only looking at one side. You need to see both sides to get the whole picture.
So even if a certain viewpoint makes me uncomfortable or goes against what I believe, it's important to at least try to see where they're coming from.
For sure. And remember, understanding doesn't mean you agree. You can listen to what someone says, think about the evidence, and still have a different conclusion. The key is to be open to the idea that you might not know everything.
That makes me think about something we talked about before, understanding the historical and cultural context. I can see how taking things out of context, whether it's on purpose or not, can lead to some pretty big misinterpretations.
It's so important. It's like trying to get a joke from another culture. If you don't know the references, you'll miss the point completely. It's the same with religious texts.
So we need to ask ourselves, who wrote this? When did they write it? What was going on in the world back then, and what were they really trying to say?
Those are all great questions to ask. And it might take some effort to find the answers. It means doing research, reading different interpretations, and even being willing to challenge our own ideas.
It's definitely not the passive way of getting information that we're used to, but it sounds like it's worth it. The more we get the context, the less likely we are to be fooled by those misleading interpretations.
And you know what? Once you start practicing this critical thinking thing, it becomes a habit. You start using it for everything you see, not just religious stuff.
So it changes other areas of life too, like how we read the news, how we see political stuff, even just how we make decisions every day.
Exactly. It's about being more aware, more discerning, and more sure of yourself and figuring out what's real and what's fake.
Okay, now I'm seeing how it all comes together.
Yeah.
But the source also talked about the role of science in questioning these misinterpretations. I think for some people it feels like faith and science can't get along.
Yeah, that's something a lot of people think. But I think faith and reason can definitely exist together. They can even help each other out. Think about it this way. Science shows us how the world works, and faith often tries to explain why things are the way they are.
I like that. It's not about picking one over the other. It's about finding a way to make them work together.
Exactly. Having faith can give you meaning, purpose, a way to understand your place in everything. And science can teach us about the world and help us make good choices and, solve problems.
The main thing is to not let one completely take over. Blind faith without any logic can lead to rigid beliefs and intolerance. And just focusing on science without any spirituality might feel empty and pointless for some people.
The awesome thing about being human is that we can believe in lots of things at the same time. We can be amazed by science and also find comfort and inspiration in our faith.
It sounds like the goal is to always be learning, to be open to new info, willing to change our minds when we see proof, and be okay with not knowing everything.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's all about enjoying the journey of discovery, both in our faith and in learning about the world around us.
And sometimes that journey might make us question things we used to be totally sure about, but that's fine. It's through those questions that we grow, That's how we understand things better and become less vulnerable to manipulation and all that fake news stuff.
So to wrap up the idea of those false prophets or egoistic interpreters, the best way to handle them isn't to block them out completely, but to really think about their ideas. Ask questions. Look for proof. Compare what they're saying to other stuff you've learned, and then you decide what you believe.
And don't forget, even those big important people, even the ones who act like they know everything, they're still human. They mess up, they're biased, and they might even have ulterior motives.
It's all about taking control, Become someone who really thinks about what they see, think for yourself, and trust your instincts. You get to decide what you believe, and you get to find your own truth.
That's a really powerful message, and it's not just about religion, it's about everything we do.
Absolutely. It's about being an active part of your own life, instead of just passively taking in whatever information comes your way.
As we finish up this deep dive, I'm left with this question. If those misinterpretations can really mess up our lives, how can we become more careful about the information we take in, whether it's religious, scientific, or whatever?
That's a really important question, and I hope our listeners will keep thinking about it even after this episode is over.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration. It's been amazing.
It was great to dive deep with you. Till next time, keep asking, keep learning, and keep looking for your own truth.